see if anyone's bold enough to write April baseball games. Hit the 70s, I love that. Flowers, budding leaves, getting out and walking around. Street cleaning. Walking without having to layer, biking to work. Lakefront trail. The longer days. Love these. No mittens. What is springtime? That's fair. That's fair. The newness of things. Oh, I love that. All right. Thanks everyone for your participation in that. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Dickett.
Good morning. So you want to go to the next slide on updates. Yes, welcome. Good morning. An update. So I'm going to briefly just let you all know a few things that have happened since we last met and that are happening now. So if you want to go to the next slide, we made a presentation to the Chicago Plan Commission. This was our third presentation to Chicago Plan Commission for information only on where we are with the process. So just to, no, go back. Don't quite go to this slide yet. So we, this slide represents a couple different things. It represents the engagement of the partners. So this is actually a picture from Enlace, a community partner, and one of the events they held as part of being a community partner and getting the word out to their constituents. And it is also the slide that we used at Plan Commission. So basically, Plan Commissioners had not heard about even how the volunteers were selected or the number of volunteers or the community partners since the last time we presented to them was a year ago, March. So we gave them that overview. And then we had actually 9 separate speakers, someone representing each pillar and the advisory committee. And then the Safe Katja did that, as well as representing a community partner to speak to how the process was going or what they learned or what they were excited about, to let the Plan Commission know just what their thoughts are. And that went really well, I think. And we also had Chloe Thans from Metropolitan Planning Council wrap that up with a little overview of the meeting in the box. So they are now all ready for our next Plan Commission presentation, which we are looking at to be next January. So now you can go to the next slide. And we want to keep them informed, as well as, and I'm just using this slide also what used at Plan Commission, because we are going to begin giving presentations to city council committees. So we do have a city council committee hearing, basically a for your information hearing, with the city council committee on the environment for March 31st. So at that time, we'll give them most likely an overview of the process, and then I expect that we'll go into sort of the goals and objectives and what's coming out of the energy, environment, climate, and energy task, our research team. So rather than having a broad view of all the pillars, I think we will focus on this one because that is the purview of this committee. And then we'll be looking at going to other committees as well and giving them an update on the work of the teams. And then the last slide, this is also what we shared at Plan Commission. And you can see with what I put here in the yellow, the other thing that we're doing right now is we are sharing the work of the research teams with city staff. So as you all know, we've gone through guiding questions, we've developed objectives. We're now deep into the policy work. In fact, I think we're halfway through. So what we have done is send those initial policy ideas to different city staff and different departments to get their first look at it so we can start getting that dialogue going. And we will then do this again after our next meeting, set of meetings, which are next week, and they will be looking at the other policies. So that's where we are right now. And I just want to also, again, thank all of the people that showed up at Plan Commission. It happened a little earlier than we thought, but everybody was there and it went off quite well, I think. So I will turn it over to the civic and community engagement pillar discussion.
Thank you, Kathy. And one piece on the last slide, if we can just hop back. You all, as a just reminder and orientation, Next meeting of the advisory committee is when we will be joined again by our co-chairs of all of the pillar research teams, and they will be reporting out to you all some of those draft policies that are currently in the making. And so we're excited for you all to have the opportunity to see them in totality, provide some input and strengthening as we do this final stretch until June, when we'll have the draft report prepared. So excited for all of your input in the month to come. And with that, I'll kick it to Juan Sebastian.
Thanks, Skylar. Thanks, Skylar, and thanks, Kathy, too. So for the next couple slides, we want to both share one update that builds on the conversation we started at the last advisory committee meeting. And that is that given all the interest or all the related recommendations around civic and community engagement that are coming through the pillar teams, we have decided to package these together and create an 8th pillar. So in addition to the 7 pillars that we've been talking about for the last however long we've been meeting, we are now going to be, we are adding on this 8th pillar currently called civic and community engagement. And this really builds on the discussion we started with you all last time that we met, where we were thinking about citywide engagement, recommendations for how that should look between the city and its residents and workers. Just to reflect on that a little bit, as you might remember, we started off that last meeting sharing some examples of how other cities have incorporated this into their own citywide plans, from New York City to Minneapolis. Both of those examples had separate goals or chapters of their plans that looked at engagement in some form. In New York City, I believe they actually called it, they framed it around a vibrant democracy or something around promoting a vibrant democracy. And then last time we met, we also divided into a couple groups and discussed 2 questions about how can we increase transparency in decision-making processes and how can we increase community involvement in decision-making processes. At the same time, as we've mentioned before too, the pillar teams, especially the ones that are listed up on this screen right now, have been deep into the work of developing their policy recommendations, and a number of them were similarly related or are similarly related to community and civic engagement, or to looking at how decisions are made at the city or within the city too. So given all this feedback, given the feedback that you all provided us last week, given the work that's coming out of the pillar teams, we decided to make this an 8th pillar. Since then, we have gone back again to look at the input, look at the recommendations coming out of the pillars, and even look back at some earlier documents or plans that were set forth by this administration and the mayor's office, including the mayor's transition team reports. And so we started looking at all those to be able to put together a set of objectives and goals, objectives, and policies related to this topic of civic and community engagement. And if we go to the next slide, we have just one example from the pillar teams of what this is looking like in more detail. So this is an example from the Housing and Neighborhoods pillar team, where they had one entire goal that was related to engagement. And these are some of the objectives that were underneath that. So just to give a little bit more, just to give a glimpse into that, these include engaging historically marginalized residents and stakeholders in neighborhood decisions and processes. This also included creating standard community-defined engagement across all neighborhoods and establishing transparent decision-making procedures. And so these are still very much in the process of being refined, and the teams right now are building out specific policies, suggestions for each of these, but just wanted to offer this as one example of how this is showing up within the work of the pillar teams themselves. So if we go to the next slide, this is after having gone through this process of looking at your input, the pillar team's input, previous recommendations that have come through around engagement, we have packaged these, or we've tried to put those all those different inputs together into these 4 additional engagement goals that we're proposing be part of this 8th pillar. And so this is going to be the meat of our working session, our final working session on this framework today. During the breakout activity, which Courtney is going to walk us through, we'll be reviewing these in more detail, and then with the hopes of getting all your insight, wisdom, and knowledge to help us really refine these into a robust set of policy recommendations for this 8th pillar. So I think, just to read these through, the way we've packaged these into these, or the way at least we're currently thinking about these 4 goals. The first is to expand Chicagoans' long-term capacity to organize and improve their lives in neighborhoods. The second is to increase Chicagoans' access to participate in the democratic process. The third is to improve government transparency and Chicagoans' access to data. And then the fourth is to eliminate barriers to accessing city services and supports. And so in the breakout groups that that we'll go into in a short bit, you're gonna see all the details underneath these, all the proposed objectives and policies that will fit within here. But this is at least a high level overview of how we're thinking about the new goals that would be part of this new 8th pillar. Great. And then when we go to that breakout session, we'll give you a 10-minute reading time so you can actually be able to dig into that a little bit more. And then I think I'll pass it to Skylar to give a little bit more context too.
Yeah, and also just double clicking on this slide, what you'll see when you go into breakouts is a lot of work that we did to listen to your input from last meeting, combine it with some of what we saw in some peer city reports. And we think it's a very good encapsulation of common themes that we see emerging across the pillars that we want to lift up because they have citywide consequences across all of the pillars. So they're not just unique to housing and neighborhoods. It's something that's also equivalent in lifelong learning. And lastly,
can I ask you to pause for a second? We need to catch up the ASL.
Oh, sure.
Sorry about that, but I want to get it right. There we are. Thank you so much.
Sure. And then you'll also see that this pillar can reflect some missing gaps that might not exist in individual pillars, but there are specific topics such as data transparency, content around elections that we really saw as missing when we looked at the content in the pillars. So we hope you think the same, but we are not wedded to anything that you're about to look at in small groups. Our goal today is to something messy for you all to then help us refine over time to get to something that we are collectively proud about. So as Juan Sebastian mentioned, it's going to be a lot of new content. So you will have about 10 minutes of just reading time in the small group to absorb some of what we're asking you to respond to today. On our next slide, I did want to tee up the kind of helpful guidance we've been providing to the research teams as they think about the process of creating policy recommendations. So we give this example as a model to think about in terms of the right level of detail that we're looking for policy recommendations. And so they often will follow this sort of formula. At the beginning, there's a measurable action. So it could be establish, expand, incentivize, explore, etc. And then the next part of the sentence is often the policy lever. So the thing that you are seeking to move or to change. In this example, it is increasing the number of voting sites. The next part of the sentence is often who the policy is seeking to focus on. So this could be a geographic community, it could be an identity-based community, it could be a particular type of entity such as Black and Brown owned small businesses in Chicago. That gives you an example of not just a general topic, but who we are seeking this strategy to impact. And lastly, often the most important is to what end, right? So making sure that the policy recommendation includes an outcome. And in this example, so that every resident lives within 1 mile of a voting site. So that often adds that little oomph, little extra specificity in order to make sure that we have clarity in implementation. So we understand some of the intentions around the first half of the sentence, if you will. So we use this as an example. Obviously we want to look for things that are sort of not so broad and vague that, the everyday person reading them would be confused. But we also don't want something that is so granular and specific that we wind up having a list of 300 different policy recommendations. because we want this to match the sort of the Goldilocks. So right in the middle, something that is specific enough that you can imagine it in real life being implemented. And then something that is sort of cross-cutting that can speak to a number of challenges within a policy area. So I hope this gives you a little bit of inspiration of the kind of detail we're looking for. And the next slide gives you some questions that we've been providing to our research teams to think about. So you all know that we've been implementing the Health and Racial Equity Impact Assessment Framework to strengthen our policy recommendations throughout the We Will process. This gives you an encapsulation of some of those questions on one slide. And I'll call out just a couple because we think it's helpful to sort of seed this next conversation by always centering these questions at the forefront. So some of the questions might be, as you read them on the slide, what problem are you really seeking to solve with this policy? So what is your desired outcome here? Does the outcome begin to repair a past or ongoing harm or inequity? Another question to consider is this benefits and burdens category. So what are the anticipated benefits and harms? Who will benefit or not from this policy? So think of this as specific identities or communities, race, disability, gender, et cetera. And then another important thing to consider is implementation. What might implementation look like? What needs to be in place to achieve this? So these are all just questions for inspiration as you walk into this policy refinement conversation to center, why are we doing this work? What are we hoping to achieve? Who are we seeking to benefit? I think all of these questions will help us get as specific as possible and create some high quality recommendations together. And lastly, I want us to think big. So this last bar, the bottom bar at the very bottom, we're thinking about short-term and long-term policies. So oftentimes the short-term may be relieving a very acute pain, relieving an acute symptom. And long-term may be the more structural, the sort of fundamental pieces that will get at more equity and resiliency over a longer time span. So we want to encourage you to think about both. In the end, we want the level of detail in this pillar to match what we're seeing in all of the other 7 pillars. So we might end up having to do some thematic collapsing of specific policies into buckets. For each of the individual research teams, they have between 3 to 5 different objectives. And underneath those objectives, they have about 4 to 5 different policy recommendations. So that gives you a sense of they can't be so granular that we would have 100. We're really going to have to make some decisions around categorizing and bundling things together. But for today's conversation, it's spaghetti on the wall. Just think about the broad brainstorm, make sure we get the ideas out there, and then we'll come back to you with some refinement after the broad brainstorm today. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Courtney to tee us up for our fun breakout activity.
Yeah, thank you, Skylar. So to recap, we took the work from our February advisory committee meeting. We looked at Chicago past and concurrent planning efforts. We looked at peer cities. We elevated work from pillar research teams and have put that into a document organized around civic and community engagement goals with supporting policy and objectives. Today, we want to follow up on our discussion from February to further refine those. And the bottom line is we're looking from you today. Are the goals, objectives, and policies that we're going to discuss headed in the right direction? Do you see any objectives or policies that are missing outright? And of the draft policies, objectives, and goals, are there any that need clarification or improvement? So we have a chunk of time today to dig into this. including 10 minutes. If you haven't had a chance to read the draft goals, objectives, and policies, kind of jot down some notes. You can underline, highlight, prepare some questions or comments. And then we're hoping to have about 10 minutes to discuss each of the goals with the supporting objectives and policies. So it is a chunk of time today, but we're looking forward to it. We know you guys are eager participants and have lots of ideas. And the fact that this is building off of our work from last month, I hope feels satisfying. We will do the same thing as we did last month, where we will leave the Google Docs open for the remainder of the week in case you think of something after our discussion today. So we'll be in 2 breakouts just to make the conversations a little more intimate. If you have any questions, you can share those now. Otherwise, the team's going to begin putting people into 1 of 2 breakout rooms, and we'll begin that conversation there. Welcome back, everyone. I know in our group, we had a robust conversation and lots of comments and questions flying in the Google Doc. Allie, how did yours go?
Ours was really great. Am I unmuted? Yes. Yeah, we had similar, really good input, thoughtful across the board, and then specific on goals.
Okay, well, Maureen from our breakout agreed to report out. I think we have a slide at saying exactly what we, or a couple of prompts, right?
Yes.
So Maureen, you don't have to stick to this script, but a couple of prompts if it's helpful, a reflection on the process and anything that emerged from the conversation in our breakout that you want our colleagues to hear.
Yeah, so I think we had a really good discussion about these different goals. And I think, you know, we continue to be excited about some of the things that are coming out of this process. In terms of the first goal, we had, you know, really liked that we were calling out specific groups that we need to do better with. We added some groups to those, but then we also, you know, take it a little bit further and thinking about, you know, the city's website and how we're disseminating information. So I thought it was really a good conversation. We kind of looked at, you know, different goals and also wondering, are they too broad? Are they too high level? And really what's the best way to go about, you know, formulating these goals.
Yeah, I appreciated everyone was game that we might not have it exactly right sized yet, but we're getting there. And that if all the ideas are in there, then we can do that next step. Allie, did you identify anyone to report out? And then after that, we'll have it open for a couple minutes for other comments or questions about the process and the discussion.
Yes, Mary Kenny from our group volunteered to report out.
Yeah, so our group was a very engaged group, I will say. We spoke right up until the last minute in terms of ideas and so forth. I think in terms of, there seemed to be absolute universal agreement that it was a really good thing to elevate this discussion to an actual pillar. Given how important it is, I think, to the overall process and, you know, its intersection with all of the other pillars. So just to give some thoughts on some of the really great ideas that came out of our group, there was a lot of talk about data, not just access to data, but what types of data we're both collecting and will be reporting out in order to make the engagement and access readily available on the right issues. So we had some good conversation around that. We also talked about engagement and how we're empowering citizens to engage. I think there was some thought that maybe the goals were weighted too heavily in terms of access access to data and outreach, and not actually how citizens would engage in order to empower them to actually impact the process, and especially with respect to some of the communities that we know have been marginalized over the years. And so on that note of engagement, we also had discussion regarding incentives and whether we should incentivize certain communities that have been marginalized and maybe less inclined to engage. How do we incent them to engage in the process so that they're actually impacting and influencing and allowing their voices to be heard? We also had a lot of conversation about, a lot of the goals seem to be outward looking. And the need for the city to be a little reflective, more introspective in terms of the permanent infrastructure that we might put in place to support this pillar, both with respect to budget and staff, in order to make sure that this was a sustained effort and not just a one-time engagement, that there would be a continued thought around that. And I guess around that too, there was some objection to the word like outreach on that front, that we needed to emphasize that this would be kind of a continued process of engagement and dialogue. I'm sure I'm missing a lot. I'm just going to look over my notes a little bit. We also discussed how, community engagement can sometimes result in engagement contrary to public policy or maybe the city's objectives. As an example, Raphael raised the issue around affordable housing, which I very much appreciate, Raphael, having lived in that world for a long time, and sometimes the opposition to affordable housing in some communities, and how do we integrate a process so that we're accounting for that potential and actually allowing for a reconciliation process. I think I covered it. I'm sure I missed a lot of good comments. There was a lot of good engagement on ours. Oh, and the one thing that I actually raised was just whether we would take a broader view of engagement and community, so that we are actually engaging partners that align with some of the goals and objectives that the city and that this group has outlined. And so, I know that there's a lot of companies like my own who are very engaged on some of the issues that we've all been talking about over the last few months, and wonder whether we shouldn't have a goal that's actually engaging partners in a more proactive way. A lot of what I think we've laid out, the city cannot accomplish on its own. And so whether those partners are faith-based organizations or corporations, would suggest that maybe we take a broader view of how we view community and how we view engagement. I think that covers it. Allie, I don't know if I missed anything, feel free.
You're muted, Courtney.
That's great, Mary. We also had a great conversation about role, what's the city's role, what is others' roles. So sounds like there's some synergies there, and I hope Roberto's happy to hear we were referencing the elevated Chicago principles and thinking about the spectrum of engagement. Any other questions or comments about today's breakout or the goals, objectives, and policies as drafted? We will leave it open for you to either amend or correct anything that a scribe attributed to you. Make sure we get that right. Or if you have new ideas, questions, or comments, you can put those in the document through the end of this week.
Yeah, and in terms of next steps, so we'll do an internal debrief of all of your great thoughts and comments today. We'll review the document, as Courtney noted, in case you want to drop in additional text into the document. We will come back to you, not next month, because next month we will have a report out from the various pillar research teams on their draft policy recommendations. So the next time we return to this content with a bit more refinement will be in the month of May.
All right, if there's no questions or comments, we're going to hear about the Equity and Resiliency Data Dashboard.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a super inspiring conversation and excited to dive in more and make those policies that much stronger with your input today. So we are so grateful. This next section is to tee up some homework offline. So we've been building an idea for a number of months now around a companion project to the We Will Chicago framework that we will all be announcing in Q1 of 2023. Our vision is at the same exact time, we would also have an interactive data dashboard that has a high level view of the state of Chicago along many measures that relate to equity and resiliency. And it can serve as an accountability tool for the plan over time as we progress in implementation. This isn't a new idea. On the next slide, I'll show you a little bit of Chicago context for this project. So some of you may know that Healthy Chicago 2025 is the Chicago Department of Public Health's process for developing a plan for public health improvement in the city. And one of their specific goals and objectives does relate to data transparency. They have a strong commitment through the Chicago Health Atlas for a production of real-time sort of state of the city information that is user-friendly. It's a great collection of hundreds of different variables. But we know that not everyone engages with the Chicago Health Atlas. It's a tool that is helpful for residents and researchers, but the city can always do more to elevate all types of quality of life indicators in order to be transparent around the state of the city and the state of neighborhoods. There's a number of different projects that connect back to this idea of a dashboard. Lauren, who's on the line, and our Chief Equity Officer, Candace Moore, have done a lot of thinking around a various type of equity-focused dashboards within the Office of Equity and Racial Justice that you can see on their website. And we have an internal commitment around data access and transparency. So I know May had noted in our last small group some of the work that already happens on the Chicago's open data portal. What can we do to really build on that and use this as an opportunity to have something that is real time, something that is mappable, something that is available for people to, again, sort of look at the state of Chicago as it relates to the citywide plan over time after it is produced. And so to that end, for this specific project, we have 3 different goals that are reflected on the next slide. The first one is that the dashboard is an evaluative tool for the city stakeholders and residents to analyze the state of the city for residents over time along a set of core measures that align to equity and resiliency and the We Will Chicago plan. So ideal state, this really becomes a tool on goal number 2 for external and internal accountability and transparency on the measures that we're striving to impact with the We Will Chicago plan. And we know that, whatever we select as metrics for this dashboard, it can't be everything. There could literally be thousands, hundreds of thousands of different measures that we add. How can this become a gateway to other data sets and sources for researchers and residents? For example, if someone is particularly interested in housing related data, how can we link them to the DePaul IHS website so they can get even more information that might relate to their organization or their personal specific interests for their communities? If someone wants more public health related data, making sure that there's an easy way they can know how to access the Chicago Health Atlas as another example. So as we think about what this deliverable could look like, that is a companion to the We Will document, which will be a bit more of a static report. The next slide actually talks about some of the principles that we've started to brainstorm internally and with a working group of some researchers who've been thinking a lot about sort of the state of the city idea for a collection of data. So what we want it to look like, all the principles here, these are nimble and editable that we're going to refine in the months ahead, but a really keen focus on accessibility and transparency, continuous improvement so that, the user experience, we're sort of looking at some of the bugs and challenges we might be getting along the way and improving it over time. These dashboards, it's something that we see is very common in other cities. but they can be a lot of work. So how do we design something that doesn't have a strong reliance on human labor, that is actually just like automatically updated with a steady stream of data from the census and other sources, publicly updated sources, so that we can minimize the amount of additional work that goes into producing it, and thus thereby it can be a bit more real time. We've seen in best practice research that, you know, the data dashboards are one thing, but having the ability to actually download the data, look at it by community level, look at it disaggregated by race, ethnicity, disability, et cetera. These are all components that community-based organizations are looking for. They often already use the Chicago data portal in that same way. So we're interested in the degree to which this dashboard can encapsulate all of those same principles as well. And this is obviously updatable. So if there's something, we'll send out these slides. And if there's principles that are missing, or you have a particular interest in this area of work, this is all available for us to customize together. I do want to share out on the next slide what we've seen in some best practice research in other cities. Not all cities have released dashboards like this with their citywide plan. So this would be a pretty contribution from Chicago. We do see that it is a common practice in relevant offices of equity and racial justice across the country, but they really, really vary in scale and format and approach. So you'll see, you know, at the very top end, you can look at a city like Oakland, and here you can see that we did research. How many of them touched on the specific pillars of our citywide plan in their equity dashboard. You can see that in Oakland, they had 72 different indicators available citywide. And then to contrast that, look at an example like Austin, which has a very, very small number of only 4, right? And so these dashboards, again, sort of, you can see on the next slide, the format can look extremely different depending on the city. So in Tacoma, Washington, as an example, they took a multi-fold approach. They have a mapping component where you can zoom into individual neighborhoods and be able to pull up the data. And you can look at it in 2 ways. You can either look at it as a compiled equity index of a number of measures that are sort of layered on top of each other, or you can look at it as individual data layers. So for example, if you're particularly interested in some of the metrics around education, you can double click on that. And then there's a series of sub measures underneath there where you can really start to look at individual measures at a neighborhood scale and then compare 2 neighborhoods side by side next to one another for different outcomes. You can also sort of level back and look at the city overall through the type of format that you see here. They also had some interesting choices around the ability to add different layers. So, you know, they might have this available in census tract, but you could also layer on the ward map on top of that. You could layer on their water district map on top of that. They made it super interactive through a GIS component. And then another city's approach on the next slide, you can see what New York did with their dashboard. So their dashboard was very focused on internal transparency around their programs and services. It's less graphical and map represented, and it's a lot more focused on sort of charts and bar graphs that can be exported into usable data sources. I think from some of our stakeholder conversations we've already had with external groups about what this dashboard could look like, folks are definitely more interested in the model that looks more like Tacoma, where you could actually zoom into individual geographies and wards and look at the data that way. But we wanted to show you a little bit about how other cities have approached this. On the next slide, I'll tee up the ask. And so through our pillar research team, a lot of the teams have been talking about data over the course of the last few months. And what they've been thinking about is how, looking at the policy recommendations and objectives that they've started to draft, what are specific data variables that they want to double click on to show in the plan as this information, this specific challenge is indicative of what we are trying to solve in our specific pillar. So for example, you know, economic development, may want to express maps around the racial wealth gap, right? To serve as a firm grounding for individuals to understand racial and ethnic wealth gaps in Chicago by neighborhoods. And so we're thinking about this a lot in terms of each individual pillar research team has already started to brainstorm a set of metrics that they think speak pretty closely to the individual recommendations in their pillars, but it's a giant list right now. So you'll see, and I'll screen share in just a second, Allie, if it's okay. I actually want to screen share the survey itself. So if you can give me access, or maybe if you can click on the link and screen share it, Allie. Thank you. So what you're going to see in this survey that we're asking you all to complete is a compilation of all of the different data metrics that the teams have compiled for each individual team. It's a pretty long list. And so, for example, in transportation and infrastructure, the list is upwards of 15 different indicators. So what we really want to ask you all as a team in completing this survey is to help the teams, because you'll have a bird's eye view, you'll be looking across the board at all of the pillars in the plan. We want your take of what are the most critical metrics to include. So what metrics must be included in a citywide data dashboard? What metrics are important but less critical to include? What metrics are less important and should be excluded? And lastly, what measures should just be excluded because they're not important? So you can kind of see they range the gamut. These have been brilliant ideas that have come from the research teams. I will just note, not all of these are available. So some of them, like the city may not even gather this data and information. That was in our earlier small group from one of our brilliant team members. So it's a lot. So what we want to ask you all to do in completing this survey, you don't need to answer it for every single pillar. If you're particularly interested in housing and neighborhoods and you want to do some rankings just specific to that pillar, you can. But all of the input on all of the pillars is going to be enormously helpful. So to recap, what we're going to ask you to do is to answer this survey between now and March 25th. So the deadline would be Friday, March 25th. We really want your take of what are the most important indicators that we should be thinking about in a data dashboard of this type? And this is just one step of stakeholder engagement as we continue to build out what this dashboard is going to look like, what the user experience would be look like, what the different features of the dashboard would look like. That is all in the months ahead, particularly gearing up after the month of June. So this is a first step for us to hear from you all as experts who have been engaged in this plan so far, thinking across the pillars, what would be the highest priority. So it may take, upwards of 20 to 30 minutes to complete the survey. And again, any and all input, both in the SurveyMonkey and offline, is going to be critically important. I'll just pause if there's been any questions in the chat that I missed. Yeah, thank you, May. You just noted the something to think about in terms of the level of disaggregation of the data, making sure that it's available at census tract and even census block level. So appreciate that. Yes, and I will drop the link to the survey in the chat. And again, you can have until the 25th to fill it out. We'll also send it out in an email after the meeting today. And we really appreciate your engagement on this specific deliverable that we think is really going to strengthen the plan and enable us to have something that is user-friendly, that people can dive into, that we hope is a complement to all of the advocacy and research that's already happening on the ground related to data. So with that, I'll pass it to Courtney to wrap us up.
One other question coming in.
Oh, yeah, I see. Will there be an opportunity to discuss different category options? I know gender options are not actually gender options since disability is often missing from the data. Yeah, great questions. I think as you look through, we don't, for each of the variables, for example, energy cost burden, we haven't called out in that specific category, energy cost burden by race, ethnicity, by gender, et cetera. What we're thinking about is, where it's possible across all of these measures to be able to disaggregate along those identity lines. And I would love to talk with you, Risa, offline, just in thinking about what you've observed as some of the challenges related to access to data and information for those that identify as people with disabilities. But yeah, I think as you go through those comments and questions are appreciated, and I'll provide my email in the follow-up in case there's like meta questions that you have that don't just relate to individual metric options that are in the survey itself.
And then Cliff said he had a question, which is fine before I do closing and next steps.
Thank you. So I'm just kind of reflecting on the pillar that was introduced. And I apologize, there was a lot of information introduced about it, so maybe I just missed it as it was happening. But is there a conversation about who's working on that? And like, what's the group that's doing that piece? And is there a plan with that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Cliff. So you all are the group that has been working on it. So I'll say there's no other individual team that is going to be advising us as closely as you are. We will come back, we'll synthesize the information that you all shared out today and some of the questions and opportunities for further refinement. And we'll come back to this topic in the month of May. If folks are particularly interested in engaging in the interim, I know, and want to raise your hand in the chat, we would love to have thought partners to do some of this refinement in the next month and a half. But we also want to be respectful of the time that you all have put in so far. So Cliff, I know in particular, you at your organization and the work of many Q fellows pertains a lot to the work in this pillar. So that's more of a call for, if this is something that you want to continue to help us work on, to then shape back a proposal that we put forward at the advisory committee in May. We could use all the help we can get. It's just us here on the line that's going to help do some of this refinement. So appreciate the support.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and also a reminder that the existing pillar teams, a number of them, at least 5, the ones we had on a slide earlier, have or are working on developing specific policies related to similar objectives too. So that's like another track of work that at some point, or sooner than later, as we start fleshing out what the final version of this all will look like, some pieces of that might might become a part of this 8th pillar if it's generalizable, if it's a very specific, if the policies recommendations are very specific and solely related to that pillar, it might stay in those individual pillars. But so just a reminder too, that there's also relevant pieces in the pillar team's work that we are going to be trying to pull from and synthesize into this as well too. So in addition to this and everyone who's raising their hands, which is amazing in the chat, there are the pillar teams as well who have been thinking about aspects of this.
Yeah, and this is Kathy. I would just add one of the things that occurred to me as we went through everything today, just thinking about what's in the pillars and what isn't, is that we have transportation and infrastructure, and part of what we were hoping to get to is like the digital, the broadband conversation there, which we really didn't. And the conversation today on, I guess it was goal number 3, all about the data. So I think we also may want to tap some people that was their focus and we didn't get to it. So there is a little bit of moving since we're doing it at this stage, but it definitely is something that rose out of all of the conversations and we need to build out.
Any other general questions or comments? Because it was a lot of info, Cliff, you're right. And we want to make sure everyone understands what we're doing, where this is going. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll send a follow-up email with a link to the Google Doc with an encouragement to keep adding to the goals, objectives, and policies. We'll send the link and a reminder to participate in the equity and resiliency data dashboard. In April, we will hear from the Pillar Research Team co-chairs about their draft policy framework. And then in May, we will spend our time together further refining the two things we discussed today, the goals, objectives, and policies for community and civic engagement, and the equity and resiliency data dashboard. Sounds like one other thing we might do is poll people about their level of comfort about an in-person joint meeting in June. Where, like everyone else, we're monitoring conditions and thought it might be nice to put a bow on this phase of the work and a little bit of celebration for all of the hard work going in, but realize not everyone might be ready for an in-person event. So I think we'll also poll everyone about that and see what we can do in either a hybrid context or some other creative approach. We can either end early or happy to take any other comments or questions. The consultant and city team will stay on the line. Appreciate everyone's time, thoughts, and energy. Looks like the sun is coming out just in time.
Thank you all. This was enormously helpful today. We know it's a lot of information, so we'll stick on if in case folks have additional questions.